This is the History of New Zealand podcast on the Eat to My Own Beat podcast network. Welcome back to episode 31 of the History of New Zealand podcast. Background to legislation of New Zealand land confiscations. Since the outbreak of the First Taranaki War at Waitara in March of 1860, New Zealand government had been engaged in an armed conflict with the Maori who refused to sell their lands for colonial settlement or surrender the undisturbed possession of their lands and estates. The 1840 Treaty of Waitangi had promised them by mid-1863 the cost of fighting the war was continuing to mount. In 1861 and 1862, the colonial defense vote was £8,031, while the British government spent about £400,000. The government still found itself unable to squash the Maori resistance. In May 1863, weeks before the outbreak of the Second Taranaki War, Charles Brown, the superintendent of Taranaki, wrote, "It would be rightful to confiscate from the tribes which should fight against us territories of sufficient value to cover fully at the cost of the war." 3 days later, Governor Sir George Grey and his ministers signed an agreement that a disputed block of land between Taramaka and Omata in Taranaki would be confiscated, and the Waitara Maori, hostile to the government, were warned they would also risk confiscation of their land. Premier Alfred Domet's ministry immediately began expanding their plans for mass confiscations. In June, the ministry was planning a line of defense posts between Auckland and Ngauruhoia, clearing all hostile natives north of the line and confiscating their lands, which would then be either given to military settlers or sold to defray the cost of war. The government published notices of these terms on the granting lands in the Omata area to military settlers in July, and a month later the land in the Waikato area, even though no legislation for confiscations yet existed. In August 1863, just 3 weeks after the invasion of the Waikato began, Attorney General Frederick Whittaker and Defense Minister Thomas Russell sent Governor Grey a memorandum signed by Premier Alfred Domet, claiming that the Waikato, the most powerful Maori tribe, were planning to drive out or destroy Europeans and establish a native kingdom. They argued that the security of the colony demanded the Maori aggression needed to be punished, and proposed that the armed population be recruited from the goldfields of Otago and Australia and settled on land taken from the enemy. Whittaker and Russell, leading Auckland financiers, speculators, and lawyers, were the most powerful men in the ministry, and stood to make a substantial fortune in the Maori south of the Auckland could be moved from their land. Grey, who had recently returned from the term of governor of the Cape Colony in South Africa, where the military settlement Exhosha land had been undertaken, embraced the idea, and in the dispatch of the Colonial Office a month later set out details of the plan, repeating the claims that the Maori planned to wholesale destruction of some European settlements. The proposal was to take place 5,000 military settlers on the Waikato and Taranaki frontiers, each holding a 20-hectare farm on military tenure. Grey attempted to allay potential misgivings in the Colonial Office by pointing out that there were only 3,355 Maori living on the 200,000 hectares in the fertile lands of the Waikato, and on this they cultivated just 6,000 hectares. He proposed making roads throughout the land to link the military settlements and towns, estimated the entire cost at £3.5 million. The funds would be raised with a loan from the Bank of New Zealand, which Defence Minister Russell had founded, from which both he and the Attorney General Whitaker hoped to profit. Security for the loan would be provided by the profits expected from the sale and confiscated land to the new immigrants. By October, the scheme had grown again, with the number of military settlers in Taranaki, Waikato, and the other areas now pegged at 20,000, with settlements linked in 1,600 kilometers of roads. In Taranaki alone, 8,000 military settlers would be spread across 40 settlements, stretching across 80,000 hectares from Waitara to Waitatera near Whanganui. Thank you for listening to the History of New Zealand podcast. We're found on YouTube and anywhere else you could find your normal podcasts. Please like, comment, and subscribe, or find us at www.eattomyownbeat.com.